Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming to our first of many events getting prepared for APIDM, which is the APIDA Heritage Month. My name is Dr. Nina Ha, and I'm the director of the Asian Cultural Engagement Center, soon to be the APIDA Plus Center. I'm very excited about that. Before we get started, I'd actually like to begin with the land and labor acknowledgement. Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tutelo and Monacan people's homeland, and we recognize their continued relationships with their lands and waterways. We further acknowledge that legislation and practices like the Morrill Act of 1862 enabled the Commonwealth of Virginia to finance and found Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native nations from their lands, both locally and in Western territories. We understand that honoring Native peoples without explicit material commitments falls short of our institutional responsibilities. Through sustained, transparent, and meaningful engagement with the Tutelo and Monacan peoples and other Native nations, we commit to changing the trajectory of Virginia Tech's history by increasing Indigenous student, staff, and faculty recruitment and retention, diversifying course offerings, and meeting the growing needs of all Virginia tribes and supporting their sovereignty. We must also recognize that enslaved Black people generated revenue and resources used to establish Virginia Tech and were prohibited from attending until 1953. Through inclusive VT, the institutional and individual commitment to UPROSM that I may serve in the spirit of community, diversity, and excellence, we commit to advancing a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community. So once again, thank you for being here, for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend. I am really excited and honored and privileged to have Dr. Banu Subramaniam to come to Virginia Tech. I'm really excited. I got to learn about her work when I was a student at UMass Amherst. And so many years later, you're here. Dr. Subramaniam is a professor of women and gender and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, trained as a plant evolutionary biologist. Dr. Subramaniam engages the feminist studies of science and the practices of experimental biology, author of Holy Science, the Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, Ghost Stories from Darwin, The Science of Variation and the Politics of Diversity. Her current work focuses on decolonizing botany and the relationship of science and religious nationalism in India. So please give a warm thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Is there a way to put the slides up?
Yes.
Well, thanks everyone. Can you hear me without a mic? Yeah. And can you hear me online without a mic? Is someone monitoring the? Yes, okay, good. That will make it a lot easier.
Slideshow.
Yeah. Great. Oh, it's anyway. Well, yeah, thanks all for coming out. I know how busy these times are, and this campus seems very similar. Trying to think, how do I stand that I see everyone with this big pillar in the middle? And this campus seems very much like mine, in that there are 10,000 things happening every day, and there's a lot of competition for our attention. What I'm going to do today is both kind of track, how it is a plant biologist, came to teach in a women, gender, sexuality studies department, but also introduce you to this field of feminist science and technology studies. And overall, try to make a case for why interdisciplinary education is so important to every part of campus. So just wanted to start with talking about gender, race, and the practice of science. I wanted to start with a quiz. So this is a flower. Does a flower have sex and gender? It's supposed to be participatory. Yes, no? Or how so? Correct. We talk about male trees, female flowers, male parts of flowers, female parts of flowers. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So a lock and a key, computer plugs, electrical things. We make one a male, one a female, and we talk about, what's missing. Okay. So this is the International Space Station. And I was at the Air and Space Museum a few years ago, and they told a story about how, Russia had its space station, the US had its space station, and then the astronauts wanted to meet. And so they had to build a bridge between the two. And both nations said, we do not want to be the female. So they had to build a bridge with two male ends. So the astronaut, from these two countries could meet. And so part of my point in these three examples is that we have cultural understandings of sex and gender and race in human society, but we have put those understandings out into the world, into locks and keys, into computer parts, into plant flowers and plant trees. And that this is not just, we just, engendering the world, but this has political consequences and questions of power. Because when something is female, it means it's lesser than the other. Right? So gender is not an innocent category. Race is not an innocent category. When we racialize and gender things, with it comes assumptions of how good you are, how clever you are. So dogs, right? There's been a lot of work in SDS, in particular animal studies, talking about how we racialize breeds of dogs. Which dogs are pretty and cute and cuddly, and which ones are aggressive and mean. And so again, across plant and animal worlds, there's been a lot of work in SDS that is showing us that, that these worlds of nature and culture, science and society are not separate. We are constantly trafficking across them. And so when we think about how, at least this is the way my campus is organized broadly into the humanities, the sciences that study the natural sciences, and the social sciences. In my university, there's a pond that separates them. When I was in grad school, there was a big, they were on two different campuses and there was a road that connected them. So not only are these separate, that we make it geographically separate, that it's difficult for people, faculty and students to actually interact with each other. And in part, what this distinction does is, one is they're defined by the object of knowledge, right? You study nature, you study society, you study culture, and they are defined by methods. The sciences use the scientific method, social sciences use qualitative and quantitative methods, and we talk about the humanities using subjective methods. And yet it is such a pity when certain objects are always connected to certain kinds of methods. And part of what fields like SDS do is to say, what if we use different kinds of methods and different kinds of objects, right? What kind of knowledge would we produce about the world? So we would never think about racialized breeds of flowers, or to think about, why do we call plants as male and female? It's only when we ask those questions, we go into the history of plants. Then we discover there was this figure called Linnaeus. And Linnaeus, in classifying plants, before there were very non-sexual terms, in classifying plants, he imagined it was based on the nuptae plantarum, or the marriage of plants. To him, every flower was a marital bed on which were husbands and wives, right? So you have monandria, diandria, one husband, two wives, right? 3 wives, 6 husbands. So that's how he classified around male and female parts. So he really made, plants and the natural world into metaphors of marriage, and organized plants, plant systematics and plant classification around the vocabulary of marriage and around male and female. And in his time, some of them found him too lewd and pornographic. That's another story we can get to. But it's only when we, mix these objects and methods, we start asking these kinds of questions that lead you to an analysis of the history and make you ask questions about the biology or the physics or chemistry that you do that you would never ask on its own. And I'm hoping to give you some examples as we go on. So very broadly, science and technology studies basically argues, at least when I studied, I very much studied this model that science is outside of culture, right? That when I'm entering my lab, miraculously, all my cultural biases leave my body and I enter an objective scientist. I do objective science, I produce objective results. Anybody else who came would do the same thing, right? That's the basic assumption. But what I'm arguing and what SDS argues is that science is very much part of culture. Scientists bring their cultural biases, their historical understandings of that particular moment to do the science that they do, to ask particular kinds of questions, to conclude, to make certain kinds of conclusions. And so, so rather than pretending that science is outside of culture, if we start understanding science and scientists as part of culture, then that means we need to be reflective of the science we do. We can't just pretend that it is what Donna Haraway calls the God's eye view, this view from nowhere that scientists can somehow achieve. And then we need to ask ourselves, who am I? Interrogate the questions we ask, interrogate the methods we use, and that would produce a very different kind of science. And so rather than thinking of the world in these binaries of nature and culture, science and society, we understand the world as nature cultures as one word. And ideas are constantly moving between nature and culture and science and society. So take a category like race, right? This is not a stable category. It has changed considerably over the time. So if you take a group like the Irish, they were not always considered white. There was a time when they were not allowed to, allowed into restaurants. But something changed politically. Similarly, questions of gender and sexuality, of what is native and alien, who is an immigrant, who is not. These are all categories that are constantly changing. But at least in the science that I studied, I just understood it as a biological variable, and I understood it to be stable and unchanging. But once you recognize this history, it changes the way in which we see the natural world. Okay. So I want to basically discuss science at 3 levels of individuals, of cultures of science, and in terms of knowledge production. It's somehow this Google thing has changed the font into a very silly mode. But anyway, so in thinking about the culture of science, so I think one of my favorite books is Sharon Trawick's Being Times and Lifetimes. And what she did in this book is she interviewed high energy physicists into asking how they studied, looking at their culture. And she concludes by saying, they think their culture is the culture of no culture, right? So physicists claim they have no culture. So her whole book is, how does a culture of no culture function, right? That itself has a set of rules of how you can go about every day with no culture, right? And so it's really quite a brilliant book. And part of what so this book sort of shaped a project I was part of, and I replicated it a couple of times. The first time I was a grad student at Duke with Mary Wire. And what we did is we had a group of male and female grad students. We had a group of male and female faculty. 2 of us, they didn't know who each other were. 2 of us carried conversations between the 2 groups. Sometimes the grad student was a member of a faculty, in the same lab of someone in the faculty. But you would think they came from 2 different worlds, because what they described of how graduate student functions was completely different. And so one of the things we did was the rules exercise. We asked the grad students, okay, you come into grad school and then you're told, by 3rd year, you need to finish your comms. You should have finished your coursework by such and such time. Are there any other rules that are not written down, but all of you think are rules? And we said everyone had to agree that it was a rule before it stayed on. So people would just shout out rules, and then if everyone agreed, it stayed there. Students came up with a long list of rules. So things like graduate school is all consuming. All truth comes through confrontation. Confrontation implies competence. Hierarchy is to be maintained. Know your place, in the hierarchical scale. Upper levels control change in the lower levels. Be aware of what you wear and the image your clothes project. This is particularly true for women. The following emotions, topics, and behaviors are not allowed: crying, insecurity, laughter, personal problems. If you're a woman, family responsibilities will distract from your career. If you're a man, it will be a bonus prize that shows your humanity and sensitivity. Helping others detracts from your personal achievements. Research is more important than teaching or coursework. Women graduate students had certain things that felt were particular to them, of always being visible. If not, they would not be serious. But they felt they could not, if they were too confrontational, they would not be considered well. I mean, the typical bitch, right? So women had to negotiate a fine line of how to be present, how to disagree without seeming too aggressive. Do your best within the hierarchy. So there were limits to how they could challenge it. You have no power to change the rules. And there was a lot of talk about personal appearance and how even in graduate school in the sciences, that becomes such a potent category that they need to address. Downplay your personal life, cry in the bathroom. And so part of what they were saying is it's not that they didn't do things they wanted to do or had to do or needed to do. They just figured out a way to do it elsewhere. So sometimes they wanted to cry. So you do not cry in the building. You go to the bathroom, you go outside the building. You do not show a sign that you menstruate, right? So you find ways to hide the tampon or whatever it is as a way to go, because those markers of gender and sex would mean you were not a scientist. Don't carry a purse. Put a good face on everything, especially when they're not going well. And you will be expected to help others. So in the other one, it was that helping others was not a good thing, but for females, you needed to. So again, it was the kind of dissembling that women felt they had to do, that as women in society, they were expected to act one way, but when they came to graduate school, it was a very different set of rules that they had to contend with. And then we asked the faculty. Anyone want to guess what rules they came up with?
Spend a lot of hours in the lab.
Spend a lot of hours in the lab, okay. I'm not going to do this, but the women and men had slightly. And there was a male faculty member who said he interviewed in shorts and slippers, rubber slippers, right? So they, every time when they said something like work all the time, someone would say, that's not true. I only come in a few hours, but some of it was speaking to what the lives of those faculty were, right? What they felt they had gotten away with, or the kind of privilege that they felt, but they did not feel these sets of rules around them. And these three set of lists really says something. Within feminist theory, there's an idea of standpoint theory. And the argument is where you are in the structures of power says something about how you see the world. So if you go to the CEO understands very little of what is happening in the building. But you go talk to the janitor, you go talk to the secretary, you talk to people in the margins of power, they know exactly when people drink coffee, how messy they are, what they do after hours, right? And so power to some extent makes you not see how systems function, but those are the margins of power are the ones that that see it best. And so in terms of and so there is much. There's some that I think there's much more we need to do to understand how cultures of science function. But here again are tools from the social sciences that can help us understand how the natural sciences function. At an individual level, this whole conversation has gotten translated into what I hate, this language of pipelines, right? This argument that we are shoving students into this pipeline of science, and then these students, some of them are leaking away, and there's not very much coming at the end. And the solution of a lot of DEI projects is how do we plug these leaks, right? And so, personally for me, the argument is if things are so miserable and people are leaking away, hurrah, let's celebrate them not being in these dingy pipes, right? So our project shouldn't be about plugging leaks. Our project should be about how do we create an environment that people feel supported, they feel engaged, that they want to be there, they don't want to leak away, that these are places in which they can thrive. So that we need a different metaphor than pipelines and leaks to talk about, graduate school, to talk about the enterprise of science, and that maybe we will focus on different kinds of things than the very limited recruitment retention tools that we use. Okay, I want to turn now to knowledge production. So we see that who does science matters and has been shaped historically. The culture of science is shaped by questions of, gender and race and sexuality and class. And third, that those things shape the knowledge that science produces about the world. And there's a famous philosopher who just died last year called Bruno Latour, who I think puts this very well. And he says, what we have done in the academy is that we've artificially purified knowledge into these binary zones, right? Non-human and human, nature and culture. But we may purify all that we want in academia to what we are studying. The world outside is producing hybrids all the time. And I think we're feeling this most acutely around climate change, where we do not have the vocabulary, we do not have the tools to understand what is a very interdisciplinary human, non-human nature culture problem. And that we really need to find ways of how to develop those kind of interdisciplinary frameworks to do this work, so that we can capture and understand these works of translation rather than this mythic purification that we do. And so in my own work, so my doctoral work was on morning glory flower color variation. And I, got interested mostly because I felt alienated in graduate school. And I met the head of women's studies who said, oh, you should, this is such a common story. I said, really? And then she said, yes, there's lots written about women in science. And so I started taking those courses. Some of my friends were interested. We did a survey of students in our departments. We were astonished. Everyone was insecure. Everyone thought they were imposters, but we had all learned to, take it till you make it, right? We had all, figured out how to present that, that front. And so this really got me interested into knowledge production. And so for a while, I would do my my greenhouse field work, and then I would take that bus across campus to take my women's studies courses, and they were very separate. My advisor allowed me to take these courses because he thought, the third world woman in the US, I should support her interests in this, and so he signed my cards to take this. But some of my other peers, the advisor said, if you have so much time, spend more time in the lab. Why are you taking courses in philosophy and gender studies or history? What does that have to do with anything? So a number of them were not allowed to take courses. But one day, that's a mentor of mine, Mary Y, I was sitting with her, and most people in women's studies, they say, what do you work on? And I'd say, work on population genetics, on morning glories. They say, oh, very nice, and change the conversation. But Mary asked me more. So I said, there are these fields that have many different colored flowers, and I'm interested in what mechanisms of natural selection maintain it. And she said, oh, you work on diversity. Had never occurred to me. These were two different worlds. And so suddenly, by making that observation, she connected the worlds of nature and culture for me. And so I started asking questions. Interesting. There are fields of many colored flowers. Why is this the question that jumped out at me? given my training in biology. And very quickly in the history of science, I hit upon eugenics and how central eugenics was to the history of population genetics, to evolutionary biology, right? And all the people I was studying in my population genetics and evolutionary biology classes had a big part to play in eugenics. And the debates we were having about, is genetic variation good or bad? What implication does that have for population genetics? Were foundationally eugenic questions, right? Is a good society a one with great genetic diversity? Or is a good society one with Beethovens and Einsteins and only the brilliant people? So these were two very different conceptions of a good society, and these population geneticists, argued about that. They argued in the models that I was studying in my classes, but underlying those models was this other history of eugenics. And that's sort of what produced this first book on understanding that nature and variation paralleled diversity and difference. Nature and culture I had studied in two different segments of my life, but they really were deeply intertwined with all the characters that I had studied in my biological education. And so this really, I think, set me on a path to try and integrate questions of nature and culture. One of the recent projects what time is it? Oh, there's a time right there, okay. Is looking at the question of invasive species. And so this is, anyone knows what this is? Tumbleweed, and what do you know about the tumbleweed? It tumbles, yeah. Sorry, goes from place to place, yeah. What else? So at some level, it's an icon of the American West, right? If you watch any of the Western films, it'll, open with this eerie sound, and then this tumbleweed will be rattling its way down. But it's actually a Russian thistle. This is a foreign plant, but somehow it's gotten to be part of the iconography of the American West, right? Of what is truly American. And so here again, I began, it started with thinking about my own life as an immigrant to the US, of realizing first I am an alien, and then you become a resident alien, then you become a naturalized citizen, right? So there were a set of categories that my visa will, show. And that we can, and I was seeing those same things that were happening in plants. It started with a project with colleagues looking at native and invasive plants in California. And as I was looking at the vocabulary in the cultural scene, it was very much what I was experiencing. And so here again, we have two categories: nature in place and out of place. And similarly in the human world, of people in place or out of place, right? And this idea of invasive species is something that is relatively new. So for example, there was a time when the American Acclimatization Society, where someone said, hey, let's introduce all the birds named in Shakespeare's plays into Central Park. Why not? So this, someone did, right? So this was a very different moment when the USDA would send plant explorers all across the world. It's like, find something interesting or new or novel. And there are individuals who themselves, one person has brought 120,000 species into the country. Right? And so part of what I'm trying to do in this new work on decolonizing botany is to think of this long history of invasive species, right? Today we say, oh, and yesterday in the Washington Post, I was like, oh, these evil plants in the garden. What should you not plant in your garden, right? So this is the vocabulary where we pathologize individual species of plants and insects and animals as evil, as undesirable. And in thinking of this, longer history through the history of colonialism. And and when we think about this longer history of this, there was a time with this very laissez-faire ecology where things moved across the country. And if you think about the project of empire or imperialism, a lot of environmental historians would argue that it is fundamentally an ecological project. because part of empire was about extraction, was about extracting resources. They took plants from one part of the country to the other. They took bacteria and viruses to different parts of the country. They created plantations of alien crop and created plantations that were desirable in different parts. And along with it came, labor and slavery and indentured servitude. So it's a very nature cultural story. And part of what we see in here is, empire has happened across the world. And Charles Mann argues that, remember Pangea, this original planet? Where it was one continent, not planet, one continent, and then it separates into different parts of the world. And then, in each of these different parts, different plants evolve. And part of what he argues is what colonialism did was reknit the seams of Pangea. Because what colonialism did was take plants from this continent to that continent to this continent. So there was such a mishmash of species across the world. And that we forget that ecological part of colonialism and how powerful it is. And then we see at a particular time in this history where we start having immigration laws that prevent certain groups from coming to the US. The immigration laws are 1 year apart from quarantine laws of plants and animals. And the plant ones comes for 1 year before that, right? And then, we have other groups. So when we look at this history again, it's a very nature cultural history where human lives and animal and plant lives are deeply entangled with each other. I want to give you just a brief experience of what this invasive species world looks like. So this is a children's book on exotic invaders are infesting America. We start very, very early with this rhetoric. Tinkering with Eden, the idea that there was this idyllic Eden in the back, and then all these immigrants came and, made it into a horrible world, and that we can return to this Eden. That alien plants are, amongst us, that they are weeds of a global, they're undesirable, they're weeds of a global garden. We use the rhetoric of wars and battles with invasive species, just like we do with humans. And as I have tracked the language in the last 20 years, after 9/11, you see how much more virulent this language becomes. So we start talking about biosecurity, that the problem is, globalization and lack of borders. And as I was looking at stories across human and animals, you see considerable parallels that both human and undesirable human and plant and animals are unhygienic, they look weird, they're taking over everything, they're indestructible. The female is already over-sexed female, a hyper prolific reproducer, fears of miscegenation. And my favorite is, the title is, they came, they bred, they conquered, right? Which says it all. Now, specifically, that was talking about kudzu. And when you actually look at the history of kudzu, it tells a very different story. The kudzu was first exhibited in one of the world's fairs. And at that time, there were real problems of erosion in this country. And so the USDA subsequently paid farmers per hectare to plant kudzu. So it would help with soil erosion. And then the plant grows luxuriously here in ways that it doesn't in Japan. In Japan, they use it in lots of ways that we don't use here, right? And so, but now when we tell the story, it's this mile-a-minute plant. This is this aggressive invader, but we don't tell the story that we brought the plant here. We planted it. We paid people to plant more of it, right? And so Karen Cardozo and I use this term, invited invasions. So much of invasion biology are invited invasions. Humans brought them here, we nurtured them here, and then of course they don't know their place, and then they become a problem. But when we call species, that this is destructive, this is evil, that's not all the story. There's a longer history to how these species came here, and we invisibilize those histories and just pathologize immigrants as the problem. And of course, in the US, this is particularly ironic given that who we consider native are the settler colonists, right? Versus Native Americans have been segregated into reservations. And so it begs the whole question of who is native. So native is a political category that people in power create, versus others are considered undesirable here. By this, I'm not suggesting that we don't have ecological problems, but I would suggest the problems are overdevelopment. The problems are our ecological and environmental policies, and that it becomes, and invasive species is a symptom of that problem. But going every weekend and pulling invasive species, I don't believe is going to solve this problem. We need to get at, what is at the heart of these problems. And with the, parallel with the militarized borders that we have seen, we are seeing this within the environmental movement as well, or how we need green patriots. So you see an exact parallel post 9/11 of just like where if you see something suspicious, you should report it in the airport. We have similar apps now. If you see a funny looking insect or a plant, you can take a picture and send it to your local ecological office. And so ultimately, humans are so much part of the story, and history of colonialism is so much part of the story. But we always tell these stories as natural and cultural, rather than understanding them as nature cultural. I think I will stop there, and I'm happy to take comments, criticisms, arguments.
Not super. Yeah, it's not, there's nothing.
So has that transfer of species from place to place, has that changed over time? 'Cause my sense from listening to campaigns like you're describing is that a lot of the wording is around inadvertent transfer. It's like, oh, I drove my trailer from this place to this place, and I didn't realize I was carrying this other thing. That's covered.
I think that within the country, I think that's true.
Mhm.
And I think people have, protocols of how you sterilize, wash away parts so that you don't carry that. But I think the larger patterns are what's already in there, in the country from another place. And I think even within biology, there are multiple narratives, but I'm talking about the one I read in the papers all the time, sort of that public narrative. And there are biologists who've been calling for other models of biology, right? That rather than divide plants into this litmus test of geographic origin, we can categorize plants in terms of their propensity to potentially become invasive. So invasive species by definition have to be forests. And so rather than say all foreign species are bad, we can try and look at the ecology of plants, the biology of plants, to figure out which ones might become invasive. So rather than a policy of foreigners being bad, we can have a different kind of biological policy. Yeah. No. And I'll tell you why. Because I really think this is a false binary. And I think it's best for me explained with respect to, for example, genetics, right? So for the longest time, we talk about genes and environment. But now we realize it's not genes and environment, they are co-produced. Right, so which gene gets turned on or off depends on the context in which that organism is growing. So it's not like there is the gene and then the environment acts and something happens. And so to me, I think the challenge is understanding this as a co-production, as something that comes to be together, which means you cannot. So in that particular model, to them, it's like, oh, there is something called nature. And then humans have perturbed it here and there. To me, the whole idea of nature is one that has been co-produced through humans. And so there was this wonderful study recently that looked at for invasive species distribution across the world. And what they found is that the impact of colonialism you can still see. So the Spanish colonial world has a particular set of species there. The British colonial world has a particular set of species there. So each of those colonial empires left legacy of what plants are there. So again, it's not as though, to me, each one of this is nature, right? But what nature is there in each part of the world depends on those histories of empire that left there. I totally understand, and this is a foundational debate in the field, right? Of whether there is a nature and then culture acts from it. And, but I think I am very much with those theorists who do not want to make that separation. By the same way, we should also say it's not as though the social is ever possible without nature, right? We are also our bodies, we are also our genes. It's not all politics, right? So we need that kind of account where these two things, and I feel this is where biology has gone. This is what biologists are saying as well. That it's not there's one thing and then something acts on it. And some of it, is also the ways in which people see politics, right? As outside of or within. But it's a great question, and I don't know if delving into it deeper here, just because there's a long history to that question. But I'm happy to chat later. Yeah.
That's why we like you were this concept of invite to invasive species. Idea of inviting invasive species, especially in the United States. And my second part of my question is actually he's kind of giving a new point of view to think about the invasive species, and also to think about this war metaphor.
Yeah.
In biology and also in the policy of property or gardening or also maybe urban planning or so if we
and also our immune system.
This
is how we talk about our immune system. Right. Yeah.
So if we don't think those species, they are invasive species, they got different names. So how can we think about the new type of
Okay.
Another problem.
Okay, so that invited invasion comes from this co-authored paper with Karen Cardoso, and the whole paper was about assembling Asian America. So we were looking at the history of Asian America across species as a multi-species category. And we were arguing is that you could tell a very different story of different Asian groups who were invited to come work on the railroad or come into, and then if you know your place and you do what is expected of you within the structures of power, then you're accepted, you can become the model minorities. Others will be seen as, disruptors, criminals, unwanted groups, disruptors, right? And so we talk about kudzu, we talk about the Asian longhorn beagle, the Asian carp. And each of these have very nature cultural stories. With the carp, they were brought in as worker fish to feed on particular algae in the Great Lakes, and now they have taken over. Yeah. And interestingly, in China, where they're considered native, they've been overfished. And they're a delicacy there. Yeah. Here, no one wants to eat them. So now they're packing them here and sending them to China, right? So this is again something about how we don't live in, we do not live. I mean, so part of what, you learn from indigenous studies and indigenous ecologies is a vision of an entangled world, of learning to live with the world around, of incorporating that into cultures, into systems of life. Versus here, part of what these things have done is we never evolved with the worlds around, but the worlds around is beyond our control. There are larger political forces that bring these different species to clean up this lake. Or are you looking at me saying I should shut up?
No. There's a question online, and also the people online were having difficulty hearing.
Oh, I see. I should stand here. Sorry.
We're
Okay.
trying to get the mic closer to you. so-
Okay. Is this
so
the
that-
mic?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so that it can pick up.
Okay. And so, so each of these have, particular stories of how they came to it. So that's where the invited invasion comes, is that you cannot tell this, you can't look at the Asian carp now and say, look what it's doing. We have to understand those histories of how they came to be. Similarly, with respect to Asian American human populations, they are not all the same, right? Each nationality has a different history with the US. And so we need to understand those entangled histories. If you email me, I'm happy to send you I can send you the paper. That article, yeah. Yeah.
So I'm just going to read a lot of the online questions that we're getting. So the first question that we have is from Carola Haas, and she says, I'm curious about whether you think it is more of a language problem or a management problem to understand ecological benefits of native species. For instance, when garden clubs adopt plans to use more native plants around yards. Doug Tallamy's books have gotten really popular with gardeners lately, for instance. Doesn't seem nefarious to me to encourage folks to plant native species.
So one is, I don't think it's just a language problem. And this is something I encounter all along, where people come to me and say, I'm really compelled by your argument. I do not want to promote these kind of xenophobic ideas. Tell me another word I can use, right? And then I have to say, the point I'm trying to make is not the word, it's the category, right? It is the imagination where we divide the world into native and alien. So it's not just an issue of language, but of course the issue of language is that when we use words like invasive, foreign, terrible, destructive, yes, those words do matter. The metaphors that make things good and evil, that there, I think language does matter. So, I think to me, native, the ecological problems of native and alien species is a symptom rather than the original problem. So we, cut forests, we overdevelop properties, we have particular kind of trade policies that allow certain kinds of movements. So when you think of something like COVID, if COVID had started in some remote village in some, other part of the planet, we probably wouldn't even have heard about it, right? It became a global phenomenon because it happened in Wuhan, which was a global city where people and things moved across the world, right? It became such an issue in many countries is because we have unequal healthcare. We have unequal access to vaccines, right? So we need to understand the pandemic not only as what one virus did, as the conditions we have created in the planet that allowed that or made that planet, made that virus be, have evolve or have the consequences across the planet. And so similarly, sometimes I think some of these plans are kind of ecological theater, that I just, work on my garden, and there are some towns that have, 70% of your plants should be native. And people would say the same thing about recycling. That so much of what we think we're doing good, putting in our recycling bins, are not actually being recycled. Right? So some of these to me are theater that make us worried about certain kinds of things. But the biggest ecological problems, when you think about the pollution in the world, when you think about land policy, when you think about ecological policy, are being carried out at a much different level, right? That are really political issues that we need to mobilize around. We do less around that, and we are happier, policing our gardens, which I don't believe is going to solve these greater problems. But the biggest issue for me with respect to the native alien is climate change, and the fact that we are already seeing changes. So now there is a new term in biology called neonative, because native plants are moving, because the climate is changing, right? The natives are no longer best adapted to the environment. So now we need to come up with new terms. So they are neo-natives, right? And so to me, I think that vocabulary has outlived its usefulness. And we need a different vocabulary of a world that is fast changing, where the environments are changing. And we need to, and this is not, there are people already working on this. We need to imagine what these futures look like and be proactive, rather than looking to the past of some idyllic Eden that existed and wanting to return to it. Restoration ecology, which is a field where people try to restore plants to their native environments, have some of the highest uses of chemicals. I mean, is that the price of, producing a native world, is adding more pollution to the world, so everything will look like we believe it once did? That was a very long-winded answer, sorry.
So this is from an anonymous attendee who says, do you categorize human urbanization and exploitation of land in your work as an invasion as well? Since humans are part of this ecosystem, human encroachment on wildlife itself causes significant issues with the spread of disease as one example. Is it accurate to assume that nature would thrive without human interference, or are we way past that point because too much harm was caused by humans to date?
I think we are way past that. But so to me, it's, as an ecologist and evolutionary biologist, this idea that there is one nature, that nature doesn't evolve, that nature doesn't change, is a really weird concept. That somehow we have this image that this is what it should look like, and that we will in whatever way produce it in that way, rather than understanding ecology in much more dynamic terms, as things that produce, that co-evolve. Now, already in different parts of the world, some so-called foreign or invasive species have become integrated in local systems. So a native butterfly, has learned to count on this foreign plant, as a place to lay eggs. So then what do we do in those cases where this integration has already happened, right? So it's looking at ecologies across the world, it's this idea of an idyllic past just doesn't hold. There's been some wonderful work in urban ecology of how frogs have had to, and birds have had to change the pitch, in which they sing or, find mates, because the cars are around and they need to be heard beyond that. There's so much of such amazing evolution that happens in urban environments. But because we have this human, non-human, urban environments are somehow seen as not nature. Nature is the forest, is the wilderness. And there's been so much good work critiquing that idea of some authentic nature that we hold on to and understanding the world in these nature cultural terms.
And then the last question comes from Vic Velraj. And they ask, I can't help but think of the field of epigenetics and how it connects to the issues you've discussed throughout this talk. Are there other fields of study similar to that happening right now?
Great question. So epigenetics has, for me, a really interesting lesson in part. Everyone knows what this is? So so within Mendelian traditional genetics, the idea was that we have the germplasm, there are mutations in the germplasm, and that can be passed on to the next generation, right? So I may cut my arm off, but my child will not be born without one arm, right? Because this is somatic tissue versus the germline is different. And there were a series of studies that suggested, and this was, I think, was in Scandinavia around famine, where they argued that the effect of that famine you could see over 3 generations. So these were so-called environmental factors, but those environmental factors somehow got encoded in the DNA and you could pass on. This is still in some circles quite controversial, how broad, how extensive epigenetics is, but the imagination has run with it. But early on, at least me and many feminists were so excited. It's like, finally, we can't say separate biology and culture. We can show that, politics matter, these things affect the body. And so, yes, we need public policy to work on poverty, to work on discrimination of various kinds. But this is where, to me, I learned the lesson that ultimately it's always power, right? So what happened with epigenetics is really further policing of women's bodies, right? So suddenly my students who might some potential day become pregnant, watch how much coffee they drink, right? So it becomes like anything you put into your body might potentially affect the child you might have one day. And so ultimately, it seems that whatever scientific discoveries we have, often those don't necessarily become sites of new public policy, of new kind of politics, but the old politics, plays into that. And so to me, epigenetics, I think, has become the narrative in there. There's a wonderful book by Natalie Valdez, Weighing the Future, where she's looking at pregnancy trials and epigenetics. And that's exactly what she finds, is that all the power dynamics of gender and race just get reinscribed in these new models of theory.
One more question, and then
Yeah, so actually this last comment, thanks. So this last comment actually feeds right into what I wanted to ask. So I hear you trying to articulate a new set of metaphors away from the ones that you're critiquing, but you've just articulated the ways in which new metaphors become, in a sense, the old metaphors. So I was just wondering, what metaphors are you drawn to? And do you see sort of emerging in biology currently that you see as promising? And where do those metaphors raise red flags for you?
That's a great question and a very big one. I'm not compelled that metaphors are going to get us out of any problem, right? So but I think we need more words, because in part, metaphors both. So there's this, wonderful work by Evelyn Fox Keller on the genetic code and how the code shaped early genetics and thinking in particular ways of computers, as opposed to what the complexity that gene regulation actually is. So I think at this point, for me, I think it's, I like nature cultural as a word that is forcing us to always think through history. I like vocabularies of entanglement. of multi-species. I mean, all of these are, to me, vocabularies and metaphorical imaginations that are forcing us not to do reductionist science, that are forcing us to, and this is such a central STS concept, right? Of always looking at how whatever we are studying is entangled with other species, with structures of power, with history, and that, thinking in those interdisciplinary nature cultural ways, to me, I feel is critical to address the kinds of questions we seem to be facing. And it's, to me, at some level, having lived through COVID, it is so disappointing it's as though nothing happened. We didn't learn any lessons. We are, back to very old ways, and the ways in which we talked about health, except there's a little more acceptance of inequality and inequality-shaped health. But it always seems like it's about inequality of access, rather the ways in which our bodies have been shaped through histories of, slavery and plantations and health inequality through generations, right? Do you have metaphors that you are drawn to? Let me
Well, I mean,
turn
I'm
it back
drawn
at
to
you.
these entanglement metaphors as well, but I'm very conscious of the fact that, 10 years from now, we're going to be critiquing them because they've given
No doubt.
rise to this whole new set of kind of political
Right.
troubles.
But I think the other thing I feel I've learned in this project of decolonizing botany is that knowledge making is a process. And this idea that, when I started the project, it was, I'm going to find this ideal map for decolonization. And I realized that is an imperial project, right? To come with one holistic thing and then top down, you impose it on the rest of the world. And that we need to, and that we are always trying to create those kind of grand theories, which are all imperial projects. And so we need to shift what it is it means to make knowledge, which is definitely that 10 years from now, we will be talking differently. I hope so. But it is that process of, moving and exploring other ways of seeing and knowing the world. And this is, I think, the other thing I've learned during COVID is that what science is and what science does and what scientists think science does has been so misunderstood in the world, right? Because people started saying, oh, last week they said, wear a mask. Now they're saying don't. Next week they'll say something else. Now they say this, right? So you can't trust science. But science never claimed that, right? Science has always been, we keep gathering data and we produce the best possible model of the world. But that imperial project that there is an oracle of truth and science is that oracle of truth is, I think we have done a very poor job in explaining what it is science does. Thank you.
I'm gonna stop.
Okay.
Recording. Let's see.